The hostess at Meridian's fine dining took one look at the old man in worn jeans and a faded military jacket and shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a dress code." What she didn't know was that this homeless-looking man carried more honor in his pocket than most people earned in a lifetime. And when the restaurant manager decided to make a scene, he was about to learn the difference between wearing a suit and wearing courage. Frank Rodriguez stepped through the glass doors of Meridian's fine dining on a crisp Thursday evening in downtown Denver. At 73, he moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body had endured more than most people could imagine. His silver hair was neatly combed, his face weathered but clean-shaven, and his eyes held the quiet intensity of a man who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. He wasn't dressed like the usual clientele. His jeans were clean but worn, his brown leather jacket had seen better decades, and his boots, though polished, bore the scars of a working man's life. To most people, Frank looked like someone who might be more comfortable at a diner than at one of Denver's most exclusive restaurants. But Frank had saved for this dinner for 3 months. Today marked the 50th anniversary of the day that changed his life forever. The day he earned the Medal of Honor in the jungles of Vietnam. He didn't talk about it, didn't wear it on his sleeve, but every year on this day, he treated himself to one nice meal. It was his quiet way of honoring not just himself, but the 5 men who didn't make it home that. The hostess, a young woman named Jessica with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer dress, looked up from her reservation book as Frank approached. Her smile faltered almost immediately as she took in his appearance. She glanced around the restaurant, filled with men in expensive suits and women dripping in jewelry, then back at Frank. "Good evening," Frank said politely, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had breathed too much smoke and dust in his younger years. "I'd like a table for one, please." Jessica's discomfort was obvious. She fidgeted with her pen, looked toward the dining room again, then cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a dress code here. Jacket and tie required." Frank looked down at his leather jacket, then back at Jessica. "I am wearing a jacket," he said calmly. "A suit jacket, sir. I'm afraid what you're wearing doesn't meet our standards." Before Frank could respond, a voice cut through the conversation like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" Kevin Walsh, the restaurant manager, strode over with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from someone who mistakes authority for power. At 35, Kevin was everything the restaurant's wealthy clientele expected to see. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Kevin had worked his way up in the restaurant industry by catering to the rich and powerful, and he'd learned that keeping undesirable elements out was key to maintaining the establishment's reputation. One look at Frank told him everything he thought he needed to know. "This gentleman doesn't meet our dress code," Jessica explained, clearly relieved to have backup. Kevin's eyes swept over Frank dismissively. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a high-end establishment and we maintain certain standards for our guests." Frank stood quietly for a moment, studying Kevin's face. He'd encountered this kind of prejudice before, people who judged worth by appearance, who confused wealth with value. "I have money to pay for dinner," Frank said simply. "I just want to—" "It's not about money," Kevin replied, though his tone suggested it absolutely was about money, or rather, his assumption about how much Frank had. "It's about maintaining the atmosphere our regular customers expect." Several diners had begun to notice the commotion. A businessman at a nearby table paused his conversation to watch. A couple waiting to be seated exchanged uncomfortable glances. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere was beginning to feel tense. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a simple brown leather billfold that had been with him for decades. He opened it carefully and extracted several $20 bills. "I have cash," he said, holding up the money. "I just want to buy dinner." Kevin's expression hardened. The sight of Frank counting out crumpled 20s only reinforced his prejudices. "Sir, this isn't about the money. You're not dressed appropriately, and I need you to leave before I call security." "Call security?" Frank repeated, his voice still calm but carrying a subtle edge that Kevin was too arrogant to recognize. A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Some diners looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed to approve of Kevin's strict enforcement of the dress code. Frank closed his wallet slowly and looked around the restaurant. His eyes took in the gold-framed artwork, the crystal chandeliers, the white tablecloths, and silver service. It was beautiful, he had to admit, the kind of place he dreamed of taking his late wife, Maria, before she passed 3 years ago. "You know," Frank said quietly, "I've been to a lot of fancy places in my life. Government buildings, ceremonies at the White House, dinners with senators and generals. Never once was I told I wasn't good enough to be there." Kevin scoffed. "Well, this isn't the government, and it's certainly not the White House. This is a private establishment, and I'm asking you to leave." Frank nodded slowly, as if considering his option. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. Not a bitter smile, or an angry one, but the kind of gentle, knowing smile that comes from someone who has perspective that others lack. "You're right," Frank said. "This isn't the White House. But you know what? I've been there. Oval Office, actually. Shook hands with President Nixon in 1971. Kevin's expression faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Look, sir, I don't know what game you're playing." Frank reached into his wallet again, but this time he pulled out something that made Kevin stop mid-sentence. It was a small, worn photograph showing a much younger Frank Rodriguez in a crisp military uniform, standing next to President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. Both men were smiling, and the president was placing something around Frank's neck. The restaurant had gone quiet. Even the kitchen noise seemed to have dimmed. Frank held up the photograph so Kevin could see it clearly. This was taken on October 15, 1971. "The president was presenting me with the Medal of Honor for actions in Vietnam. Saved 5 men from my unit when we were pinned down by enemy fire for 18 hours. Kevin stared at the photograph, his face going pale. Around them, other diners had begun to lean in, trying to see what was happening. "You see," Frank continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. "I don't usually talk about this, don't like to make a fuss, but since you seem to think I don't belong in nice places, I thought you should know. I've eaten dinner with 3 presidents, testified before Congress, and been honored by generals whose names are on buildings." The silence in the restaurant was now complete. Even the servers had stopped moving. Frank carefully put the photograph back in his wallet and looked directly at Kevin. "But more importantly than any of that, I served this country for 12 years. I bled for it, lost friends for it, and came home to build a life here. I worked construction for 30 years after the service, raised 3 kids, paid my taxes, and minded my own business." Kevin opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Now," Frank continued, "I understand you have a dress code. That's your right as a business owner. But what you don't have, the right to do, is treat people like they're less than human because of how they look." A man at a nearby table, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, suddenly stood up. "Excuse me," he said, walking over to Frank. "Did you say you're a Medal of Honor recipient?" Frank nodded. "Frank Rodriguez, 1st Cavalry Division." The man's expression changed immediately to one of deep respect. "Colonel James Mitchell, retired Air Force." He extended his hand, which Frank shook firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, Say Hook." But what happened next would transform not just Kevin's understanding of honor, but the entire restaurant's perception of what respect really means. Colonel Mitchell turned to address the restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a clear, commanding voice, "this man is Master Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. He earned it by single-handedly holding off an enemy assault for 18 hours while evacuating his wounded comrades, despite being wounded himself." A ripple of shocked murmurs went through the dining room. Several people stood to get a better look. A woman at a corner table had tears in her eyes. Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger. "The Medal of Honor is given only to those who display valor above and beyond the call of duty. There are fewer than 70 living recipients in the entire United States. This man is a living hero." Kevin stood frozen, his face now completely white. He looked around the restaurant at the faces staring at him, some in shock, others in disgust at his treatment of Frank. An elderly woman at a table near the window called out, "Young man, you should be ashamed of yourself." A businessman stood up and began clapping. Others joined in until the entire restaurant was giving Frank a standing ovation. Frank stood quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it with grace. When the applause died down, Colonel Mitchell turned to Kevin. "Son, this man has done more for your freedom to run this restaurant than you could possibly understand. The least you could do is show him some respect." Kevin finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" Frank interrupted gently. "That I was a war hero? Would it have mattered if I wasn't? Would my money have been good enough if I was just a retired construction worker?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kevin had no answer, because they both knew the truth. Frank's military service shouldn't have mattered. He should have been treated with respect regardless of his background. Frank put his wallet away and adjusted his leather jacket. "You know what the real shame is? I came here to honor 5 good men who died 50 years ago today. Men who gave their lives so that places like this could exist, so that people could build businesses and chase dreams and live in freedom." He paused, looking around the restaurant at all the faces watching him. Those men would have been happy just to make it home and have a simple meal with their families. They never got that chance. Frank started to turn toward the door, but Colonel Mitchell stepped forward. "Sergeant Rodriguez, please. Don't let this man's ignorance ruin your evening. It would be my honor to have you join my wife and me for dinner." Frank looked over at the colonel's table where an elegant woman was nodding enthusiastically and gesturing for him to come over. "That's very kind of you," Frank said, "but I think I've caused enough of a scene for one evening." "You haven't caused anything," called out the businessman who had started the applause. "The only scene here was caused by prejudice and poor judgment." Kevin finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Mr. Rodriguez, please. Let me get you a table. The best table in the house, on the house." Frank studied Kevin's face for a long moment. "You're offering me a free meal because you found out I'm a war hero. What about the next person who walks in here wearing work clothes? Will you treat them with respect too, or only after you check their credentials?" Kevin swallowed hard. I need to think about that." "Good," Frank said. "That's a start." Colonel Mitchell approached Frank again. "Sergeant, I insist. My wife would never forgive me if I let a Medal of Honor recipient leave without joining us. Besides, those 5 men you mentioned, I think they'd want you to have that dinner you came for." Frank considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're probably right about that." As Colonel Mitchell led Frank to his table, the entire restaurant watched in respectful silence. Several diners nodded to Frank as he passed, and the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier reached out to briefly touch his hand. "Thank you for your service," she whispered. Kevin stood alone near the hostess station, watching as his entire staff and customer base witnessed what real dignity looked like. The contrast between Frank's quiet strength and his own embarrassing behavior was not lost on anyone in the room. As the evening progressed, word spread throughout the restaurant about Frank's identity. One by one, diners approached his table to shake his hand, thank him for his service, or simply nod respectfully as they passed. The atmosphere had completely transformed from one of exclusivity and judgment to one of honor and respect. Frank shared stories with Colonel Mitchell and his wife, talking about his years of service, his late wife Maria, and his children. For the first time since Maria's death, he felt truly welcomed somewhere, truly valued for who he was rather than what he owned. The chef, hearing about the situation, personally prepared Frank's meal and sent out the restaurant's finest dessert with a note, "For a true American hero." As the evening wound down, Kevin finally approached Frank's table. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by genuine remorse. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, not just for tonight, but for my attitude in general. You've taught me something important about respect and dignity." Frank looked up at him. "And what's that?" "That real class has nothing to do with clothes or money. It comes from character and service to others." Frank nodded. "That's a hard lesson for some people to learn. I'm glad you figured it out." Kevin hesitated, then continued. "I'd like to ask you something. Would you consider coming back? Not as my guest, but as a regular customer. I promise you'll always be welcomed here with the respect you deserve. I'll think about it, Frank said. But remember, it's not just about how you treat me. It's about how you treat everyone who walks through that door. As Frank prepared to leave, Colonel Mitchell insisted on walking him to his car. Several other diners followed, creating an impromptu honor guard for the elderly veteran. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Mitchell said as they reached Frank's pickup truck. It's been an honor meeting you. You've reminded me why I served, and why it mattered. Frank shook the colonel's hand firmly. Thank you for standing up for me in there. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Colonel Mitchell replied. We look out for each other. That's what veterans do. As Frank drove home, he reflected on the evening. It hadn't gone as planned, but in some ways, it had been better than he'd expected. He'd been reminded that there were still people who understood honor, who valued service, who recognized that true worth isn't measured by appearances. Most importantly, he'd honored his fallen comrades in a way they would have appreciated, by standing up for what was right, by showing dignity in the face of disrespect, and by reminding a room full of people what real heroism looks like. Final rehook, because sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't taught in a classroom or a boardroom. It's taught by a 73-year-old veteran in a leather jacket, who reminds us that honor isn't something you wear on the outside. It's something you carry in your heart. The next week, Kevin Walsh implemented new policies at Meridian's fine dining. The dress code remained, but the attitude changed completely. Staff were trained to treat every customer with respect, regardless of appearance. A small plaque was installed near the entrance reading, "All who have served our country are welcomed here with honor." Frank did return to the restaurant a month later, this time wearing his dress uniform for a Veterans Day celebration that Kevin had organized. The entire evening was dedicated to honoring local veterans, with proceeds going to a homeless veterans shelter. But the most significant change wasn't in the restaurant. It was in Kevin himself. The encounter with Frank had stripped away his superficial understanding of worth and replaced it with something deeper. He began volunteering at the local VA hospital, serving meals to veterans and listening to their stories. Frank continued his quiet life, working part-time at a local hardware store and spending time with his grandchildren. He rarely talked about his military service, but word had spread throughout the community about what happened at Meridian. People who had never noticed him before began to see him differently, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as a reminder that heroism often walks among us unrecognized. The photograph from the Oval Office went back into his wallet, where it had lived for 50 years. Frank didn't need it to prove his worth. His actions spoke louder than any medal or ceremony ever could. The 5 men he had saved that day in Vietnam would have been proud, not of the attention or the recognition, but of the quiet dignity with which their friend had handled himself when faced with disrespect. They would have understood that the real victory wasn't in the medal of honor around his neck, but in the character that earned it. In a world that often confuses wealth with worth, appearance with value, and status with honor, Frank Rodriguez had reminded a room full of people what really mattered. He had shown them that true class isn't about what you wear. It's about how you treat others, how you carry yourself when no one is watching, and how you respond when your character is tested. The next time you see someone who looks different, who doesn't fit your expectations, who seems out of place, remember Frank Rodriguez. Remember that you never know who you're talking to, what they've been through, or what they've done for others. Real heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like your neighbor, your coworker, or the old man in line at the grocery store. Sometimes they're wearing work clothes instead of uniforms, carrying lunch pails instead of briefcases, and driving pickup trucks instead of luxury cars. But they're heroes nonetheless, and they deserve our respect, not because of what they've done, but because they're human beings with dignity and worth. Frank Rodriguez understood this, and now, thanks to one embarrassing encounter in a fancy restaurant, so did everyone else who witnessed what happens when real honor meets real prejudice. The honor always wins. 3 months after the incident at Meridian's, Frank received an unexpected phone call. It was from the White House Veterans Affairs Office. Word had spread about the restaurant confrontation through social media and veteran networks, and the story had reached high levels of government. "Mr. Rodriguez," the voice on the phone said, The President would like to invite you to a special Veterans Day ceremony at the White House. Your story has inspired countless Americans to reflect on how we treat our veterans." Frank chuckled softly. "Ma'am, I appreciate the gesture, but I didn't do anything special. I just tried to buy dinner." "Sir, with respect, that's exactly why your story matters. You showed grace under pressure, dignity in the face of disrespect, and reminded us all what true honor looks like." The ceremony was beautiful. Frank stood with other veterans in the Rose Garden as the President spoke about service, sacrifice, and the importance of recognizing heroes in our everyday lives. But for Frank, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a young veteran approached him. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the young man said, "my name is David Chen. I'm a Marine who served in Afghanistan. I saw the video of what happened at that restaurant, and it changed how I see myself." Frank looked at the young man's earnest face. "How's that, son?" "I've been struggling since I came home. PTSD, you know? I felt like I didn't matter, like society had moved on without me. But watching you stand there with such dignity, seeing how people responded when they learned who you really were, it reminded me that my service mattered too." Frank placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Your service absolutely matters. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." David nodded, tears in his eyes. "I started going to therapy after I saw your story. I'm getting better, and I wanted to thank you for showing me that being a veteran is something to be proud of, not something to hide." That conversation meant more to Frank than any medal or ceremony ever could. He realized that his simple act of standing up for himself had created ripples far beyond a single restaurant. Back in Denver, Meridian's fine dining had become something of a pilgrimage site for veterans. Kevin Walsh had embraced his role as a supporter of those who served, and the restaurant now hosted monthly gatherings for local veteran groups. The walls were decorated with photos and stories of service members, and Kevin had learned the names and backgrounds of every veteran regularly. Frank became a fixture at these gatherings, not as a guest of honor, but as a friend and mentor to younger veterans. He would sit quietly at his usual table, the same one Colonel Mitchell had shared with him that first night, and listen to their stories, offer advice, and remind them that their service had value. One evening, a homeless veteran named Tommy Williams showed up at the restaurant. He was dirty, clearly struggling with addiction, and exactly the kind of person the old Kevin would have turned away immediately. But the new Kevin saw him differently. "Good evening, sir," Kevin said respectfully. "Are you here for the veterans' dinner?" Tommy looked around nervously, clearly expecting to be kicked out. I heard you serve veterans here? I served in Iraq, but I look kind of rough right now." Kevin smiled warmly. "Your service honors us. Please let me show you to a table." Frank watched this interaction from across the room and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The lesson had taken root and was growing into something beautiful. As Tommy was seated and given a meal, other veterans in the restaurant made space for him at their table. They heavy stories, offered resources for help with housing and addiction services, and most importantly, treated him with the respect due to someone who had served his country. That night, as Frank prepared to leave, Kevin approached him one more time. "Rodriguez, I want you to know that you've changed my life. Not just my business, but who I am as a person." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Change is good, son, but remember, it's not about one moment or one lesson. It's about choosing to be better every single day." "I understand that now," Kevin replied. "And I want you to know that every veteran who walks through that door will be treated with the honor they deserve. That's a promise." Frank shook Kevin's hand firmly. "That's all any of us can ask for." As Frank drove home that night, he thought about the 5 men who had died 50 years ago. He wondered if they could see what their sacrifice had helped preserve, not just freedom in the abstract, but the freedom for people to learn, to grow, to become better than they were. His simple desire for a quiet dinner had turned into a movement of respect and recognition. Vets across the country had reached out to share their own stories of discrimination and disrespect, but also stories of kindness and honor from unexpected places. Frank realized that his story wasn't really about him at all. It was about the capacity for human beings to see past their prejudices, to recognize worth in unexpected places, and to choose respect over judgment. The Medal of Honor in his drawer was just a piece of metal and ribbon. The real honor was in how people treated each other, how they lifted each other up, and how they chose to see the humanity in everyone they met. And sometimes, it took an old veteran in a leather jacket to remind the world what honor really meant. The honor always wins. Always.